Anthony Housefather, Alistair MacGregor, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Now, both of you have talked about misinformation and disinformation in the past. But, Anthony, I'm going to start with you because you're part of the ethics committee. You've been looking into misinformation, disinformation, how that affects the work of parliamentarians. What concerns you most? Based on what you've heard in testimony, what concerns you the most?
I think what concerns me the most is that social media companies have tons of misinformation floating upon it. Most people today, especially young people, get their news from platforms like TikTok or other social media platforms. And when you get your news from there, you start believing every little thing that you read on there. And what the social media platforms also do is they use algorithms to direct you to content that they believe you will like in order to monetize the platform and keep you there as long as possible. So people, if you believe in a certain type of misinformation, are directed to more of that misinformation. And eventually you come out with a worldview that is very different than if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail or the National Post.
Mm-hmm. Alistair, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would largely agree. I think what people have to remember about social media platforms is that these aren't your traditional public squares. They are all owned by a company which is interested in turning a profit. And they do that by generating more content that gets people engaged. And often that's content that makes people angry or anxious. And again, through the algorithms that they employ, it drives people further down into echo chambers, which tends to reinforce. And I think, like Anthony, I was first elected in 2015. And I think one of the troubling things I've seen is that people will come to you with alternative facts, which are verifiably not true, but they're so firmly held in belief by people, and you can't really use a logical type of argument because so much of their emotion is tied into it, so much of their worldview. So it's very challenging because I've always prided myself in being a politician who tries to deal with facts and uncovering the truth, but it's made our job a lot difficult.
It made your job, and not only you, because CPAC commissioned a poll, which Abacus Data did for us. And in their survey, they found that 46% of people said they consider disinformation a major threat to democracy. So if that is, nearly 1 in 2 of Canadians being surveyed saying that, what should the government be doing to stop the spread of disinformation?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things that need to be done. Some of it government related, some of it not. Number one, we need to make sure that foreign actors are not involved in our democracy spreading misinformation. I think one of the things that you sort of learn is that the posts that you're seeing on X or other platforms isn't necessarily done by the person across the street or in your city or in Canada. They could be coming from Russia, they could be coming from Iran, they could be coming from countries that have a specific reason why they want to create division within North America and Canada and the United States. Anti-Semitism, for example, Michael, is being used by Russia and by Iran to try to divide Canadians and Americans by putting up posts that simply amplify hate and try to encourage people domestically to have that hate. So we need to find a way to deal with that, and we need to make social media companies actually deal with the problem because they're the ones that control the posts, they're the ones that control what the algorithms are. And you don't want to have laws that say what you can or cannot post, but you need to have truth seekers, you need to have fact checkers that will say, this post is actually not accurate. Please go read X. And some social media companies are better at doing that than others.
Mm-hmm. Social media, but does that mean to say that it should lean more on social media, not on governments?
Well, to me, government cannot be the arbiter of what you read or don't read, because if in the end, right, you don't want the party in power to be able to control what the press writes or what social media companies can or cannot write or what you can or cannot write. But there's a lot of misinformation floating out there, and to me, the responsibility is that of the social media company to allow for flagging of that and to not use algorithms to drive you into a cesspool where if you believe in conspiracy theories, all the posts that you read are from that conspiracy theory, and that is what they do.
Mm-hmm. Alistair, what would you say to that in terms of government responsibility versus others?
Well, I mean, I think we need some measure of algorithmic transparency at holding these companies accountable for their terms of service and investing in fact-checking, because again, I know people might grow concerned about a growing government role in this, but in the absence of that, what you're essentially saying is you're trusting people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg to do the policing for you. You know, billionaire CEOs whose only interest is to get more profit returned to their companies to pad their bank accounts. So again, if you remove the word social, these are media companies. You as a journalist and all media, traditional media, are held to journalistic standards. I think we need to see some sort of similar thing where there is some reliable way of fact-checking the content that is put out there, because again, it gets disseminated so fast and so quickly, and we're often having to be put in the positions as politicians to react to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I obviously agree with Alistair about algorithm transparency. I mean, that is something that is absolutely required, and also there is legislation now on that would hold social media platforms to follow their own rules and respect their own rules, and that is completely within bounds. Mm-hmm. I think the only issue gets into whether or not you require them to actually verify that everything placed on their platforms, which is coming from third parties, is true or not true. That might be a bit of a stretch.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because we're talking about social media. I'm wondering about politicians, though, too. You know, if journalists have a journalistic standard, do politicians need to be held to a standard as well? Because you use the terminology, Alistair, of alternative facts. That came from Kellyanne Conway in regards to a comment made by a politician. Do politicians harm democracy by using disinformation to make their argument? And if so, do politicians need to be held accountable at some level?
Well, I suppose the great way of holding a politician to account is come election time. That is the ultimate accountability test for a politician. But again, there are certain politicians, and this happens in all countries, which have built up a personal brand as being sort of an over-the-top type of personality, and maybe, you know, cherry picking some of the facts to suit a narrative that they're trying to sell people. It's hard because we want our politicians to enjoy that freedom of speech, of being able to rise up to the moment to say what is on their mind. But again, there has to be some kind of a mechanism, and I'm not sure I have the actual answer here, where they're also held to account, or at least where we help the people who elect them hold them to account with some kind of a fact-checking system.
What do you say to that, Anthony?
Well, I mean, I think you have Donald Trump as a perfect example, right? I mean, the number of lies that he told while he was president were in the thousands, and then he created a scenario that was never provable before any court, that the entire 2020 election results had been distorted. And yet, 40% or more of the American population still believes him, and half of Americans want to elect him president again. Yeah. So this, to me, is in complete full light of the fact that he lies completely and often. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you would be able to hold politicians to the journalistic standards you're talking about, but I think that all politicians themselves have responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. I think that we need to try to bring the temperature down, not bring the temperature up, and not try to make people hate each other. And I think that, unfortunately, there's a number of our colleagues whose goal seems to be to make people angry all the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I appreciate the time on this. Anthony Housefather, Alistair MacGregor, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael.